And that's it for this course section. We built this Roll a Dice app here, where we can press a button to generate a random number between 1 and 6 and show different dice roll images on the screen. And whilst we built this application from scratch, starting with an empty main.dart file, we of course had a very detailed look at many core Dart and Flutter features you will need for basically all Flutter apps you're about to build, and you will need as a foundation for the rest of this course, of course. Now, as mentioned, it all started with an empty main.dart file in this lib folder in a new Flutter project, because it's this main.dart file that is evaluated as the first file when your Dart Flutter app starts on a device. Now, of course, you in this section learned that technically this Dart code which you write in that main.dart file and in the other Dart files is not executed like this when the app starts on a device, but instead after development, when preparing it for publishing, Dart parses your code files from top to bottom and then compiles that code to native iOS or Android machine code, and it's that machine code that's then shipped to those devices, so that's then in the end installed from the app stores, for example, and it's therefore that compiled code that is in the end executed on those devices. Nonetheless, you as a developer write your code with Dart and Flutter, and therefore you learned that indeed it starts in the main.dart file, and there it starts with the main function. And functions are one of the core concepts you learned about in this course section. Like many other programming languages, Dart allows you, the developer, to create functions which are simply custom commands. And you can of course not just create functions, instead you can also use functions that are built into Dart or provided by Flutter, which is a Dart framework in the end. And that's exactly what we're doing in this custom main function here. We're executing this run app function, which is provided by Flutter, and which is why you have to add this Flutter import to your main Dart file to unlock these Flutter features like run app in this file here. And it's then in the end the combination of that main function in the main Dart file being executed automatically by Dart, and that run app function that's provided by Flutter telling Flutter what should be drawn onto the screen. So which kind of user interface should be displayed on the screen. And for that, run app needs a so-called argument. It needs a widget or a combination of widgets typically that in the end tells Flutter what should be displayed on the screen. Because Flutter, as you learned, is all about widgets. It's all about combining different widgets in code. And that's also important. In this section, you learned that you in the end tell Flutter what to display on the screen by using these so-called widget things in your code, like material app, scaffold, center, container, and many other widgets, including custom widgets, which we also built in this section, which you can use in conjunction to all these built-in widgets that are provided by Flutter, like for example the buttons or various layout widgets that are provided by Flutter. In addition to those, you can also add your own widgets, as you learned in this section. And that is really important. When building apps with Flutter, you have no visual drag and drop editor for doing that. Instead, you build your UI in code. You define the user interface by writing code and by combining these widget things. And these things here are actually objects based on classes, as you learned. Because Dart is an object-oriented language, and therefore all values in Dart are objects. That includes simple values like text or numbers, but it also includes more complex values like widgets. Everything is an object, but those more complex objects are built based on classes, which act as blueprints for objects. And objects are in the end simply data structures stored in computer memory, so in the device memory on which your application is running. And these data structures store data, like for example the text of a text widget that should be output on the screen, but also logic, functions that can be attached to classes, Like, for example, this roll dice function, which we added to a class in one of our custom widgets to make sure that when this button is pressed in our application, which is rendered with help of the text button widget provided by Flutter, that when that happens, when that button is pressed, this roll dice function is executed. That's why we're using classes in Flutter, especially also when creating custom widgets, as we're doing it here, to group data and logic functions together into one data structure. And that was another core concept about which you learned in this section. You also learned that Dart is not just object-oriented, but that types are important. That Dart is a type-safe language, which simply means that all the values you are working with are of certain types. For example, the text hello world would be of type string. A number could be of type int for integer if it's a number without decimal places, and the material app widget would be of type material app, because you can also create your own custom types. And for example, every class you define also automatically creates a type of the same name. You also learned that values are not just of one single type, but instead of multiple types. They are always of type object, at least, because all values are objects in Dart, but they might also be of other additional types. For example, material app is not just of the very specific material app type, but it also has the more general widget type. And this type feature exists in Dart to make sure that you're not accidentally using the wrong type of value in the wrong place. Like, for example, passing some text as a value for width, when this actually wants a number. Now, in this section, when building custom widgets, you also learned that there are two main kinds of custom widgets, stateless and stateful widgets, with the difference being that stateless widgets have no internal changing data, which when changed should update the UI, whereas stateful widgets indeed do support internal data that may change and where such data changes then should lead to an updated UI. Like here our dice roller widget, which in the end allows us to change the value of the current dice roll variable, and which then makes sure that this change and this updated value is reflected in the user interface by calling this build method again, which, as you also learned, is a crucial part of custom widgets. You add build methods to those widgets to define which widget or widget combination should be yielded by that custom widget, because custom widgets in the end are about combining other widgets and possibly enriching that combination with extra logic, as we're doing it here. A key difference between stateless and stateful widgets then is that for stateful widgets, you actually create two classes, a widget class and a state class, and behind the scenes Flutter makes sure that these two classes work together, whereas for stateless widgets, you just have a single class which directly contains that build method, which I just explained. And in this section, you also learned how you can leverage constructor functions, which are functions that are executed when you create a class, when you use a class, like we're doing it here with gradient container in the main Dart file, when we create this widget combination to pass it to run app. That when you instantiate classes, the constructor function of that class is executed, and this function can be used for some initialization work, but you can also use it to accept arguments, positional or named arguments, and these parameter values can then be stored in internal variables, which then can be used in the build method, for example, so that you build reusable custom widgets, where one and the same widget, like gradient container here, could be used in different places of your application with different configurations and values. And these were just the most important features about which you learned in this course section. Of course, there also were other features covered, like for example how the code editor, Visual Studio Code in my case, can help with writing code. You also learned about how const can be used to potentially optimize performance, and that thankfully Visual Studio Code tells you when you can use const. You learned about variables, which are data containers, and about final data containers, which are also like variables, but unlike variables, can't be overridden or changed. And therefore, at this point, you now don't just have your first basic app that you built together with me, but you also have that solid foundation which you can now use to dive deeper into Flutter and Dart, which is exactly what we will do in the next course sections.